One of my favourite Harold Pinter plays is Party Time. It's set in an apartment in a city like Sydney. In an apartment in a city like Sydney. A party is in progress. People are drinking good wine and eating canapes. They seem happy. They're chatting and affirming and smiling. They're quite stylish and very self-aware. But something is happening outside in the street. Something terrible and oppressive and unjust, for which the people at the party share responsibility. Inside the apartment, there's a fleeting sense of discomfort, a fleeting silence before the chatting and laughing resumes. How many of us live in that apartment? Let me put it another way. A friend of mine is a very fine Israeli journalist called Amira Hass. She went to live in and report from Gaza. I asked her why she did that. She explained how her mother, Hannah, was being marched from a cattle train to the Nazi concentration camp at Bergen-Belsen when she saw a group of German women looking at the prisoners. Just looking, saying nothing, silent. Her mother never forgot what she called this despicable looking from the side. I believe that if we apply justice and courage to human affairs, we begin to make sense of our world. Then, and only then, can we make progress. However, if we apply justice in Australia, it's tricky, isn't it? Because we're then obliged to break our greatest silence, to no longer look from the side in our own country. In the 1960s, when I first went to South Africa to report apartheid, I was welcomed by decent, liberal people whose complicit silence was the underpinning of that tyranny. They told me that Australians and white South Africans had much in common, and they were right. The good people of Johannesburg could live within a few kilometres of a community called Alexandra, which lacked the most basic services, the children stricken with disease. But they looked from the side and did nothing. In Australia, our indifference is different. We've become highly competent at divide and rule, at promoting those black Australians who tell us what we want to hear. At professional conferences, their keynote speeches are applauded, especially when they blame their own people and provide the excuses we need. We create boards and commissions on which sit nice, decent, liberal people, like the Prime Minister's wife, and nothing really changes. We certainly don't like comparisons with apartheid South Africa. That breaks the Australian silence. Near the end of apartheid, black South Africans were being jailed at the rate of 851 per 100,000 of population. Today, black Australians are being jailed at a national rate that is more than 5 times higher. Western Australia jails Aboriginal men at 8 times the apartheid figure. In 1983, Eddie Murray was killed in a police cell in Wee-Waa in New South Wales by, I quote, a person or persons unknown. That's how the coroner described it. Eddie was a rising rugby league star, but he was black and he had to be cut down to size. Eddie's parents, Arthur and Leela Murray, launched one of the most tenacious and courageous campaigns for justice I've known anywhere. They stood up to authority. They showed grace and patience and knowledge, and they never gave in. When Leela died in 2003, I wrote a tribute for her funeral. I described her as an Australian hero. Arthur is still fighting for justice. He's in his 60s. He's a respected elder, a hero. A few months ago, the police in Narrabri offered Arthur a lift home and instead took him for a violent ride in their bull wagon. He ended up in hospital, bruised and battered. That's how Australian heroes are treated. I'm very pleased to say Arthur is here tonight. In the same week, the police did this, as they do to black Australians almost every day. Kevin Rudd said that his government, and I quote, doesn't have a clear idea of what's happening on the ground in Aboriginal Australia. How much information does the Prime Minister need? How many ideas? How many reports? How many royal commissions? How many inquests? How many funerals? Is he not aware that Australia appears on an international shame list for having failed to eradicate trachoma, a preventable disease of poverty that blinds Aboriginal children? In August this year, the United Nations once again distinguished Australia with the kind of shaming once associated with South Africa. We discriminate on the basis of race. That's it in a nutshell. This time the UN blew a whistle on the so-called intervention, which began with the Howard government smearing Aboriginal communities in the Northern Territory with allegations of sex slavery and paedophile rings in unthinkable numbers, according to the Minister for Aboriginal Affairs, for Indigenous Affairs. In May last year, official figures were released and barely reported. Out of 7,433 Aboriginal children examined by doctors, 39 had been referred to the authorities for suspected abuse. Of those, a maximum of 4 possible cases were identified. So much for the unthinkable numbers. Of course, child abuse does exist in Black Australia and White Australia. The difference is that no soldiers invaded the North Shore, no white parents were swept aside, no white welfare has been quarantined. What the doctors found, they already knew, that Aboriginal children are at risk from the effects of extreme poverty and the denial of resources in one of the world's richest countries. Billions of dollars have been spent, not on paving roads and building houses, but on a war of legal attrition waged against black communities. I interviewed an Aboriginal leader called Puggy Hunter. He carried a bulging briefcase and he sat in the West Australian heat with his head in his hands. I said to him, "You're exhausted." He replied, "Look, I spend most of my life in meetings, fighting lawyers, pleading for our birthright. I'm just tired to death, mate." He died soon afterwards in his 40s. Kevin Rudd has made a formal apology to the First Australians. He spoke fine words. For many Aboriginal people who value healing, the apology was very important. The Sydney Morning Herald published a remarkably honest editorial. It described the apology as, and I quote, "a piece of political wreckage that the Rudd government has moved quickly to clear away in a way that responds to some of its supporters' emotional needs," unquote.